Briley brothers. Imagine a city where locking your doors at night doesn't guarantee safety, where evil doesn't come in the form of one man, but three brothers, bound by blood and united by violence. Richmond, Virginia, 1979, a year that would burn itself into the city's history as the Briley brothers turned ordinary neighborhoods into hunting grounds. Linwood Earl Briley, James Dyrrell, J.B. Briley Jr., Anthony Ray Briley. Together, they formed a trio that transformed robbery into ritual and murder into entertainment. What began as break-ins and petty thefts escalated into home invasions, sexual assaults, and cold-blooded killings. For months, the people of Richmond lived in fear, wondering if the next knock at their door would be the last sound they ever heard. It started quietly. Small robberies, a burglary here, a theft there. But soon, the Brileys' taste for violence grew insatiable. They didn't just rob homes, they terrorized them. Victims weren't faceless strangers, they were neighbors, mothers, fathers, children. The spree left at least a dozen dead lives extinguished in cold, calculated brutality. Among the victims was Mary Gowan, a 6-year-old woman whose life ended in unspeakable violence. There was Christopher Phillips, just 17 years old, his youth stolen before it had a chance to bloom. And there was John Harvey, Johnny G. Gallagher, 62, who fell to their savagery as if his life meant nothing. But perhaps the most horrifying crime was against the Wilkerson divided by Barton family. Imagine your home invaded, your sanctuary turned into a killing floor by men who viewed human life as disposable. The Brileys didn't discriminate by age or gender. Their spree was a storm of chaos, and every victim was a target of opportunity. What made their crimes even more chilling was the randomness. They didn't kill for necessity. They didn't kill because someone resisted. They killed because they could. Robbery was only the pretext. Murder was the real message. Their arrests brought temporary relief, but the terror they had inflicted left scars that would never fully heal. In court, prosecutors laid out their crimes like a ledger of horror. Witnesses described the blood, the bodies, the sheer sadism. The verdicts were as damning as the evidence. Capital murder. Linwood and J.B. Briley were sentenced to death. In 1984 and 1985, the state of Virginia carried out those sentences, ending the lives of two of the most feared killers the city had ever known. The youngest brother, Anthony, was spared execution but condemned to life in prison, a life where freedom would never again be his. But even behind bars, the Brileys haunted Richmond. Their crimes remain a grim reminder that evil can grow not just in one man's heart, but in an entire family. Brothers who should have protected each other became brothers who killed together. The Briley brothers left bodies behind. Yes, but more than that. They left behind a city permanently scarred by the knowledge that monsters don't just exist in nightmares. Sometimes they live in the house down the street. And while Richmond exhaled after their executions, another state, Oklahoma, would soon draw its own breath of terror. Because one man, caught in the haze of robbery and death, would leave a community asking the same dreadful question: who really pulled the trigger? Kuwasi Balagoon and the Brinks robbery, the 20th of October, 1981. The streets of Nanuet, New York, seemed quiet, an ordinary autumn day in Rockland County. But beneath the surface, a storm was about to explode. An armored Brinks truck, carrying nearly $1.6 million in cash, rolled into a shopping mall lot. Its guards thought they were on another routine stop. They weren't. Because waiting for them was a group of heavily armed radicals, members of the Black Liberation Army, aligned with remnants of the Weather Underground and other militant factions. Among them, Kuwasi Balagoon, a man already infamous for his revolutionary zeal, his militant discipline, and his willingness to shed blood for a cause. The plan was simple on paper: ambush the Brinks truck, seize the cash, and fund their political revolution. But reality, as always, was far messier. The ambush came swiftly. Shots rang out. Guard Peter Page never had a chance. He was cut down almost instantly, his blood soaking the asphalt. The heist had claimed its first life. The robbers transferred the money into a U-Haul truck, believing they could vanish into the suburban sprawl. But law enforcement was already closing in. Local police set up roadblocks. What happened next was a scene ripped from a war zone. As officers confronted the U-Haul, the militants opened fire. The quiet of Rockland County was shattered by automatic weapons. Bullets ripped through the air, metal twisted, windows exploded. In the chaos, 2 police officers, Edward O'Grady and Waverly Brown, were gunned down. Brown, notably, was the first African-American police officer on the Nyack force, killed by men who claimed to be fighting for black liberation. The irony was as bitter as it was tragic. 3 men dead, families torn apart, a community left stunned. This wasn't just a robbery anymore. This was a massacre. The aftermath unfolded like a sprawling crime drama. Some suspects were caught immediately at the scene. Others fled and were hunted down across the country. Trials dragged on for years. Convictions piled up. Murder, robbery, conspiracy. Sentences ranged from decades to life. Kuwasi Balagoon himself never made it out of prison. He would later die behind bars, his life spent in cages after his years spent in militancy. The Brinks robbery became infamous not just for the stolen money, but for the blood it spilled. Unlike a standard heist, this wasn't motivated by greed alone. It was political, ideological. But for the families of Page, O'Grady, and Brown, the ideology didn't matter. What mattered were the coffins lowered into the ground. What mattered were the children left fatherless, the wives widowed, the communities scarred. Emmanuel Littlejohn, Oklahoma City, the 19th of June, 1992. The neon hum of a convenience store sign lit the night, a beacon for late-night travelers, workers, and families. Inside, store owner Kenneth Mears was tending to his business, as he had countless nights before. For him, the store was more than just income. It was his livelihood, his pride, his legacy. But at 26 minutes past midnight, that ordinary night turned into a crime scene that would haunt Oklahoma for decades. 2 men entered the store, Emmanuel Antonio Littlejohn and his accomplice, Glenn Bethany. They weren't there for groceries. They weren't there for conversation. They were there for money, and they were willing to take it by force. The robbery began like so many others: demands, threats, the looming presence of a gun. But within minutes, robbery escalated into something irreversible. A gunshot cracked through the store. Kenneth Mears, the hard-working owner, collapsed. The man who had built his life around that business lay dying on the very floor he had mopped, stocked, and worked on for years. The killers fled, but the community was left shattered. The death of Mears wasn't just a statistic, it was personal. He was known, he was respected, and in one act of greed, he was gone. Police quickly apprehended Littlejohn and Bethany. The case that unfolded in court was a legal and moral battlefield. Littlejohn admitted being part of the robbery but insisted he wasn't the shooter. He claimed Bethany had pulled the trigger. Bethany, meanwhile, denied it. The evidence was messy. Witness testimony, forensic details, conflicting accounts, all tangled into a knot of uncertainty. But what wasn't uncertain was this: Kenneth Mears was dead, and both men had played a role in the crime that killed him. The jury didn't buy Littlejohn's defense. They found him guilty not just of robbery, but of murder. The sentence: death. Bethany, tried separately, received life without parole. For years, Littlejohn fought his sentence. Appeal after appeal, he argued he wasn't the triggerman, that his death sentence was unjust. His case drew attention from activists, attorneys, and journalists. The question lingered: should a man die if he didn't fire the fatal shot? But the law was clear. Under Oklahoma statutes, participating in a felony where someone dies makes you just as guilty as the one who pulled the trigger. And in 2024, after 32 years of legal battles, Emmanuel Littlejohn's appeals ran out. He was executed, his name added to the long list of men who entered prison young and left only by lethal injection. The execution closed the book for the courts, but for Mears's family, the pain never ended. 32 years didn't bring him back. 32 years didn't erase the sound of that gunshot or the sight of his body on the store floor. Jimmy Wilson, if Chester Dwayne Turner represents the archetype of a predatory murderer who left bodies across a city, Jimmy Wilson's case illustrates a different but equally unsettling chapter in American criminal justice. How robbery, violence, and racial prejudice converged in the Deep South to produce one of the most infamous death penalty cases of the 20th century. Jimmy Wilson was a five-year-old black farm laborer in Alabama in 1957 when he committed what seemed, at first glance, to be a petty crime. On a hot summer night, Wilson entered the home of Estelle Barker, a 74-year-old white widow, and demanded money. Barker lived in Marion, Alabama, in a modest rural residence. According to trial testimony, Wilson assaulted her and forcibly took $1.95 from her purse. Barker claimed he choked her during the encounter and attempted to coerce her into sexual acts, though she ultimately survived the ordeal physically. Despite the fact that Barker lived and despite the robbery involving less than $2, Wilson was arrested and charged with robbery, a capital offense under Alabama law at the time if violence was involved. The trial was swift and deeply shaped by the racial tensions of the Jim Crow South. Wilson, a black man accused of assaulting and robbing an elderly white woman, was tried before an all-white jury. The jury convicted him of robbery with violence, and the judge sentenced him to death in Alabama's electric chair. The verdict shocked many observers. While Alabama law technically permitted the death penalty for violent robbery, executions for crimes not resulting in death were rare, even then. The fact that Wilson was sentenced to die for stealing $1.95 drew international outrage. Newspapers across Europe condemned the ruling, and the U.S. State Department faced diplomatic embarrassment as the case was cited as evidence of racial injustice in America during the Cold War. Civil rights organizations, including the NAACP, took up Wilson's case. They argued not only that the sentence was disproportionate, but also that it reflected systemic racial bias. The governor of Alabama, Jim Folsom, came under intense pressure to intervene. Ultimately, after appeals and widespread protest, Wilson's death sentence was commuted to life in prison. He served time but was later released on parole after nearly a decade behind bars. Though Wilson's case does not involve murder, Estelle Barker survived the robbery. It became infamous because of how the justice system equated a minor theft with a capital crime when racial dynamics were involved. In some retellings, Wilson's case is incorrectly remembered as a robbery murder, largely because of the death penalty aspect and the severe violence of the crime. What makes Jimmy Wilson's story significant in the context of robbery-related crimes is not the body count, but the way it highlights how the law treated robbery with extreme violence as nearly equivalent to homicide. In a sense, Wilson's case sits on the borderline of the robbery-murder category. No life was taken, but the state was prepared to take his life in return for the robbery. The legacy of the case is stark. Wilson's ordeal became a symbol of the death penalty's misuse, of racial disparities in sentencing, and of how robbery cases were sometimes inflated to capital offenses in order to exact the harshest possible punishment on black defendants. Historians still cite the case as an example of disproportionate justice, while legal scholars note its role in sparking debates over proportional sentencing. Chester DeWayne Turner. Chester DeWayne Turner's name is often invoked in the same breath as South Los Angeles's darkest era, a period when serial killers prowled the neighborhoods, preying on vulnerable women amid the crack epidemic, gang violence, and poverty of the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds. Among the chilling gallery of predators that included Southside Slayer and Grim Sleeper, Lonnie Franklin Jr., Turner's crimes stand out not just for their brutality, but for the cold indifference with which he discarded his victims like trash. At least 14 women and an unborn child were confirmed murdered at his hands, and he remains one of Los Angeles's most prolific killers on record. Turner was born in 1,966 inches, Warren, Arkansas, but relocated to Los Angeles with his family at an early age. He grew up in South Central, a neighborhood marked by social instability and economic hardship. Turner never established a steady career. For a time, he worked as a pizza delivery man, but his adult life was punctuated by odd jobs, frequent arrests for minor offenses, and an increasing descent into predatory violence. His victims were almost exclusively women from marginalized backgrounds, often homeless, struggling with drug dependency, or involved in sex work. The hallmark of Turner's killings was the combination of sexual assault, robbery, and strangulation. Most of his victims were lured under the pretense of transactional encounters, assaulted, robbed of money or personal items, and then murdered. Turner strangled his victims manually or with improvised ligatures, ensuring death before leaving their bodies behind in alleys, vacant lots, or derelict buildings across South Los Angeles. The murders spanned from 1,987 to 1,998, a period when Los Angeles was overwhelmed with violent crime, and the police often struggled to connect cases involving marginalized victims. Early deaths attributed to Turner included Diane Johnson, 21, whose body was found in 1,987 inches, a loss, Angelus Alley and Annette Ernest, 26, found in 1989. The killings escalated in the 1,990 seconds, with Turner targeting women such as Cynthia Johnson, Desiree Jones, and Andrea Triplett. In 1998, Turner killed Regina Washington, who was 6 months pregnant. Both she and her unborn child perished. Despite the sheer number of bodies recovered, the crimes remained unsolved for years. The turning point came in 2002, when Turner was convicted of raping a woman in Los Angeles. His DNA was collected and entered into California's CODIS database. 2 years later, forensic analysts discovered matches linking Turner's DNA to multiple unsolved murders in South Los Angeles. The breakthrough set off a wave of renewed investigations. By 2007, Turner was convicted of 10 murders, making him the most prolific serial killer in Los Angeles at the time. In 2014, prosecutors secured convictions for 4 additional murders, bringing his total confirmed count to 14, though investigators suspected there could be more victims whose cases were never connected. Turner's sentencing was severe. He received the death penalty and remains housed on San Quentin's death row. Prosecutors emphasized the special circumstances of multiple murder, robbery, and rape, ensuring that his punishment reflected the scope of his crimes. What makes Turner especially relevant to the robbery-murder context is the way theft intersected with his killings. Victims were often robbed of cash, jewelry, or clothing in the aftermath of sexual assault, showing that Turner's violence was not only predatory but also opportunistic. Unlike some serial killers motivated by compulsion alone, Turner's crimes often involved calculated theft alongside murder, which reinforced the danger he posed to the community. Brandon Council, what if I told you that a single moment of greed could transform an ordinary Monday afternoon into a scene from your worst nightmare? What if that moment involved a young man who would forever shatter the lives of 2 families, leaving behind a trail of blood that would haunt a small southern community for years to come? The Crestcom Bank on Highway 501 was supposed to be safe. Banks always are, aren't they? Security cameras, alarm systems, trained staff, Henksetter, all the modern defenses against the unthinkable. But on that sweltering summer day, none of those precautions mattered when Brandon Council walked through those glass doors with murder in his heart. At just 26 years old, Council appeared unremarkable to the casual observer. Born in 1991, he was part of a generation that had grown up in the digital age, surrounded by endless opportunities and possibilities. Yet somewhere along the way, his path had taken a dark turn, a trajectory that would culminate in one of South Carolina's most shocking bank robberies. Inside the bank, 2 women were simply doing their jobs. Donna Major, 59, had been serving customers with the kind of warm Southern hospitality that defined small-town banking. A devoted mother, she had built her life around service. Service to her family, her community, and her customers who trusted her with their most precious assets. At the manager's desk sat Catherine Katie Skeen, just 36 years old, a rising star in the banking world who balanced her professional responsibilities with raising her children in nearby Green Sea. Neither woman could have imagined that their ordinary workday was about to become their last. When Council entered the bank, he wasn't just carrying a weapon, he was carrying the accumulated weight of whatever demons had driven him to this moment. The security footage would later reveal a man who moved with terrifying purpose, his actions calculated and cold. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was something far more chilling. Premeditated violence against innocent people whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The robbery itself was brutal in its efficiency. Counsel's demands were met with compliance. Both women knew the protocols, understood that money could be replaced, but lives could not. They did everything right, followed every safety procedure they had been trained to execute. It should have been enough. But for Brandon Counsel, it wasn't. The gunshots that rang out that afternoon didn't just end 2 lives, they destroyed entire families. Donna Major's children lost their mother, a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for others. Katie Skeen's children were left without the guiding hand of a mother who had worked tirelessly to provide for their future. 2 families, forever scarred by one man's inexplicable decision to value money over human life. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Federal authorities took the lead, recognizing the severity of a crime that had shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. The evidence against Counsel was overwhelming. DNA, fingerprints, witness testimony, and security footage all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. This was cold-blooded murder committed during the course of an armed robbery. When the trial began in September 2019, prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had methodically planned and executed a crime that left 2 women dead for reasons that defied comprehension. The defense struggled to find mitigating factors in a case where the evidence was so damning and the violence so senseless. The federal jury's verdict came swift and sure, guilty on all counts. On October 3, 2019, they recommended the ultimate punishment, death. For a brief moment, it seemed that justice would be served in the most final way possible. But justice, as those families would learn, is rarely that simple. Albert Thompson. In small-town South Carolina, the hum of rural life was predictable. Families knew their store owners by name. Transactions weren't just about goods, they were about trust, about community. That trust was shattered when Albert Thompson walked into a rural store, armed with a gun and desperate for money. The day started like any other. The proprietor, a man whose name is often lost in the reporting, but whose presence was central to his community, opened his shop as he had countless times before. He had no reason to suspect that by nightfall his life would be over. Thompson entered with a plan. Take the money, get out. No one needed to die. But robbery has a way of unmasking the worst in human nature. Words were exchanged, tension spiked. The store owner, perhaps out of shock or defiance, didn't immediately submit. And in that split second, Thompson's panic overtook him. The trigger was pulled. The sound of the gunshot ripped through the still air. The store owner fell. The man who had served his neighbors for years lay bleeding out on the wooden floor of his own shop. What makes Thompson's crime particularly haunting is its raw human failure. This wasn't a carefully planned execution. It wasn't a political act. It was a moment of fear, of poor judgment, of selfish panic. And yet, the result was the same. An innocent man was dead, a community was shattered, and another robber had left a body behind. The trial was swift. The facts were clear. Thompson had killed during a robbery. Under the law, that made him guilty of capital murder. The jury sentenced him to death. Legal scholars would later cite the case in discussions about the death penalty. Should panic-driven killings be punished with the same severity as calculated murders? Did Thompson deserve to die for a crime committed in fear, not in cold-blooded malice? The debates raged. But for the victim's family, the arguments didn't matter. Their father, husband, friend was gone. For Thompson, the sentence meant years awaiting execution, the weight of his actions pressing down every day. He wasn't remembered as a revolutionary or as part of a notorious gang. He was remembered as the man who turned a rural store into a killing ground. The contrast between Thompson and the Briley brothers, or between Thompson and the Brinks militants, is stark. But the lesson is the same. Robbery, once it escalates, doesn't just steal money. It steals lives. Alan Bridgers. What if I told you that sometimes death doesn't come in shadows or with warning, it comes wearing the face of an ordinary man walking among us? Tyler, Texas, the 25th of May, 1997. The air was hot, heavy with the kind of southern stillness that makes every sound sharper. Somewhere in that stillness, a woman named Mary Amy, 53 years old, was just trying to live her life. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't famous. She wasn't reckless. She was ordinary. Ordinary enough to believe she was safe. But she wasn't. Because watching, waiting, was Alan Bridgers. Bridgers wasn't a teenager acting out of impulse. He was a grown man, deep into adulthood, fully aware of consequences. At 35, he wasn't supposed to be reckless anymore. He should have known better. Yet what lived inside Bridgers wasn't immaturity, it was something colder, more calculating. He wasn't just looking to rob someone. He was looking to dominate, to strip someone of everything, including the one thing you can never get back: life. The robbery started like so many do, swift, aggressive, the demand for valuables, the looming presence of a gun. For Mary, it must have been terrifying. Imagine it. One moment, you're breathing freely. The next, there's a man in front of you, weapon in hand, his eyes dead with intent. Do you scream? Do you run? Or do you freeze, hoping compliance will keep you alive? But compliance meant nothing to Bridgers. Mary posed no threat. She wasn't armed. She wasn't fighting back. Still, a shot rang out. A bullet tore through her body, cutting her life short in an instant. The silence of Smith County was shattered, replaced by the echo of violence. It was over just like that. But for Mary's family, the real horror had only just begun. Imagine being the one to get that phone call, the call that tells you someone you love, someone you thought was safe in a small Texas town, has been stolen from you, not by fate, not by illness, but by a man who wanted money and chose murder as the price. The trial that followed in April 1998 pulled the mask off Alan Bridgers. Prosecutors laid bare every detail. They showed the jury the cold mechanics of his crime, the planning, the robbery, the killing. Witnesses described his demeanor, his lack of remorse, the way he carried himself as though life and death were decisions only he had the right to make. And when the verdict came, it was as chillingly final as the gunshot he had fired: death. Since then, Bridgers has spent over 25 years on Texas death row. Think about that. 25 years locked in a cage, his name inked into the state's list of condemned men. For Mary's family, though, time hasn't erased the pain. Every appeal, every delay is another twist of the knife. They lost her in an instant. He continues to breathe. But here's the most terrifying truth about Bridgers. He wasn't unique. His story forces us to face the randomness of evil. Mary didn't live dangerously. She wasn't in a criminal world. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if that could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. Alan Bridgers is a name you may not know. But in Tyler, his crime is a wound that never healed. Eugene Broxton. Imagine checking into a motel room with your spouse, seeking nothing more than a place to rest for the night. Now imagine that decision becoming the last one you'll ever make. For Sheila Dawkins, a routine stop in Harris County, Texas, became the final chapter of a life cut brutally short by a predator who viewed human beings as nothing more than obstacles to easy money. Eugene Broxton was born on February 27th, 1955, into a world that was rapidly changing around him. By the time he reached his 36th year in 1991, he had already lived through the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and the economic upheavals of the 1972nd and 82nd. But none of those historical contexts could explain or excuse what he was about to do in that Channelview motel room. The details of that May evening read like something from a horror novel, except the blood was real, the screams were genuine, and the victim wasn't going to get up when the credits rolled. Sheila Dawkins, traveling with her husband Waylon, had no way of knowing that their decision to stop for the night had put them directly in the path of a man capable of unthinkable violence. Broxton's method was as crude as it was effective. Armed robbery wasn't just his crime, it was his specialty, and he had refined his technique through previous encounters that had somehow failed to land him behind bars permanently. But this time would be different. This time, he wouldn't just take money and disappear into the night. This time, he would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. When Broxton entered that motel room, he brought with him a level of violence that shocked even hardened investigators. Sheila Dawkins, faced with an armed intruder, likely complied with his demands. She probably handed over whatever money they had, maybe begged for their lives, perhaps tried to reason with a man who had abandoned reason long before he knocked on their door. It wasn't enough. The attack that followed was savage in its intensity. Broxton didn't just rob his victims, he brutalized them with a ferocity that suggested this was about more than money. This was about power, about control, about the twisted satisfaction that comes from holding another human being's life in your hands and choosing to snuff it out. Waylon Dawkins survived, but the word survived hardly captures the full horror of what he endured. He didn't just lose his wife that night, he lost his faith in human decency, his sense of safety, his ability to trust the world around him. He became a living witness to evil incarnate, forced to carry the memory of his wife's final moments for the rest of his days. The investigation into Sheila's murder revealed the methodical nature of Broxton's criminality. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was calculated violence perpetrated by a man who had likely killed before and would certainly kill again if given the opportunity. When Eugene Broxton was finally captured, tried, and convicted of capital murder, Texas justice moved with characteristic efficiency. The death sentence seemed inevitable for a crime so heinous, so senseless, so devoid of any redeeming qualities. Broxton would pay the ultimate price for his ultimate crime. But here's where the story takes a twist that would be unbelievable in fiction. Eugene Broxton is still alive. More than 3 decades have passed since Sheila Dawkins drew her last breath in that Texas motel room. 33 years of appeals, legal maneuvering, and bureaucratic delays have kept Broxton breathing while his victim remains 6 feet underground. At 68 years old, he has become one of the longest-serving death row inmates in Texas, a distinction that would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. The appeals process that was supposed to ensure justice has instead become a mockery of it. While Sheila's family has aged, grieved, and tried to rebuild their shattered lives, her killer has been fed, housed, and medically cared for at taxpayer expense. He has watched the world change through the narrow windows of death row, seen technology advance, witnessed historical events unfold, experiences that were stolen from his victim in a moment of unspeakable violence. Today, Eugene Broxton wakes up each morning in his cell, another day, older, but still very much alive. He has outlived many of the investigators who worked his case, some of the lawyers who prosecuted him, and countless other death row inmates whose cases moved through the system more efficiently. The question that haunts those who remember Sheila Dawkins is simple. When will justice finally be served? When will the man who showed her no mercy finally face the consequences of his actions? In Texas, where justice is supposed to be swift and sure, Eugene Broxton's continued existence stands as a testament to a system that has failed both his victim and the society she was meant to protect. Richard Bernard Moore. Richard Bernard Moore was 34 years old when he made the decision that would ultimately cost him his life 25 years later. Born on February 20th, 1965, Moore had lived through the Reagan era, witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall, and seen America transform in countless ways. Yet on that September night in 1999, all of those years of experience, all of those opportunities for growth and redemption, culminated in a choice that would seal his fate and end another man's life. The Nico Food Mart was supposed to be a quick score. These convenience stores were easy targets, minimal security, single employee, cash registers filled with the day's earnings. For career criminals like Moore, it was almost routine. Walk in, show the weapon, demand the money, and disappear into the night. Simple, clean, and relatively low risk. But nothing about that night would prove simple. James Mahoney was behind the counter when Moore entered the store. At first glance, Mahoney might have seemed like just another minimum-wage employee grinding through another late shift. But he was so much more than that. He was someone's son, someone's friend, a man trying to make an honest living in a world that offered few guarantees. He had no way of knowing that his shift would be his last, that the next customer through the door would be carrying not just a weapon, but a willingness to use it. The robbery itself should have been straightforward. Mahoney, faced with an armed intruder, complied with Moore's demands. The cash register opened, the money was handed over, and for a moment, it seemed like this would be just another crime statistic. No one hurt. Property stolen. No one hurt. Case eventually forgotten. But Richard Moore had other plans. The gunshot that ended James Mahoney's life wasn't fired in self-defense. It wasn't the result of a struggle or a moment of panic. Security footage and forensic evidence would later reveal the cold, calculated nature of Moore's actions. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was murder disguised as theft, the deliberate elimination of a witness who could identify his attacker. The investigation that followed was thorough but hardly complex. Moore had left behind enough evidence to convict a dozen men. Eyewitness fingerprints, DNA, eyewitness accounts from the moments before and after the shooting. When he was finally arrested, The case against him was so overwhelming that even his own defense team struggled to find grounds for reasonable doubt. The trial that began months later painted a picture of a man who had crossed the ultimate line. Prosecutors presented evidence of premeditation, of a criminal who had entered that store not just to steal, but potentially to kill. The defense argued for mitigating circumstances, for the kind of mercy that Moore had failed to show James Mahoney. The jury's verdict was swift and unanimous: guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence was equally decisive: death. But here's where Richard Moore's story takes an extraordinary turn, one that would stretch across nearly a quarter century and raise uncomfortable questions about the very nature of justice itself. For 25 years, Moore sat on death row while his case wound through the appeals process. 25 years of appeals, motions, stays of execution, and legal maneuvering that kept him breathing while James Mahoney remained 6 feet underground. During that time, something remarkable happened. Even the judge who had originally sentenced Moore to death began to have second thoughts. In an unprecedented move, the sentencing judge filed a request for clemency, arguing that Moore's case warranted reconsideration. The same man who had looked Moore in the eye and sentenced him to die had come to believe that execution was no longer appropriate. It was a development that would have been shocking in any case, but in a capital murder case, it was virtually unheard of. The clemency request sparked a debate that went far beyond the specifics of Moore's case. Supporters argued that 25 years on death row constituted cruel and unusual punishment in itself, that the system had failed by allowing such an extended delay between sentence and execution. Others maintained that the time Moore had spent behind bars was irrelevant. He had committed murder, been sentenced to death, and justice demanded that the sentence be carried out. As the years passed and Moore aged from a 3-4-year-old killer into a 5-9-year-old grandfather, his case became a symbol of everything that was broken about America's death penalty system. The appeals process that was meant to ensure fairness had instead created a situation where victims' families were forced to relive their trauma for decades, where killers grew old and died of natural causes before the state could execute them. On November 1st, 2024, Richard Bernard Moore's long wait finally came to an end. At 6:24 p.m., he was pronounced dead by lethal injection at the Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. He had spent more than half of his remaining life on death row, growing from a middle-aged criminal into an elderly inmate who bore little physical resemblance to the man who had murdered James Mahoney 25 years earlier. The execution itself was routine by South Carolina standards, final, efficient, and final. Moore's last words were reportedly brief, offering neither apology nor explanation for the crime that had brought him to that gurney. In the end, he died as he had lived, thinking primarily of himself. But Moore's death raised as many questions as it answered. Had justice been served, or had the 25-year delay rendered the execution meaningless? Was the Richard Moore who died in 2024 the same man who had committed murder in 1999? And perhaps most troubling of all, what did Moore's prolonged survival say about a system that promises swift and certain punishment for the most heinous crimes? James Mahoney's family, who had waited more than 2 decades for closure, finally saw the man who killed their loved one pay the ultimate price. But the victory, if it could be called that, felt hollow after such an extended delay. Justice delayed had indeed become justice denied, not just for the victim, but for everyone involved in a case that had dragged on for far too long. Nathaniel Woods. Nathaniel Woods was 28 years old when his life intersected with a drug operation that would ultimately cost him everything. Born into a world where opportunities were scarce and alternatives were limited, Woods had made his share of poor decisions by 2004. But nothing in his background suggested he was capable of the violence that would define his final years. The house on Ensley Avenue was supposed to be just another drug operation, INA-FI, the kind of low-level dealing that plagued urban communities across America. Woods was involved, certainly, but as a minor player in a game where the rules were written by desperation and enforced by violence. It was a dangerous world, but one where most disputes were settled with fists or harsh words, not gunfire. That changed when 3 Birmingham police officers came calling. Carlos Owen was 58 years old, a veteran of the force who had seen everything the streets could throw at him. Harley Chisholm III, at 40, was in the prime of his career, balancing the demands of law enforcement with raising his own family. Charles Bennett, just 33, still believed that police work could make a difference in communities like Ensley. All 3 men were fathers, husbands, sons, men who had chosen to serve their community despite the risks. When those officers approached the house on Ensley Avenue, they were conducting what should have been a routine drug investigation. They had warrants, backup was available, and they followed proper procedure. But nothing about that June afternoon would prove routine. The confrontation that erupted inside that house lasted only minutes, but its consequences would reverberate for years. When the shooting stopped, 3 police officers lay dead, and Nathaniel Woods found himself facing the electric chair for murders he didn't commit. The actual shooter was Kerry Spencer, Woods' accomplice in the drug operation. Spencer had opened fire on the officers with an assault rifle, killing all 3 in rapid succession. The evidence was clear, the ballistics were conclusive, and Spencer himself never denied pulling the trigger. He was the killer, but under Alabama law, that didn't matter. Prosecutors charged Woods as a co-conspirator, arguing that his involvement in the drug operation made him equally responsible for the officers' deaths. They claimed that Woods had acted as a lookout, that he had helped set up the ambush, that he was as guilty of murder as the man who had actually fired the shots. The case against Woods was built on a legal theory that made co-conspirators equally liable for crimes committed in furtherance of their criminal enterprise. It was a theory that had been used countless times before, usually in cases where multiple defendants had actively participated in violent crimes. But Woods's case was different. He was being charged with capital murder based not on his actions, but on his proximity to someone else's actions. The trial that followed in 2005 was a study in prosecutorial overreach and systemic failure. The jury that would decide Woods's fate was not unanimous in their recommendation for death, a fact that should have given everyone pause. In most death penalty states, unanimous jury recommendations are required for capital punishment. But Alabama allowed judges to override jury recommendations, creating a system where a single person could sentence someone to death even when jurors had doubts. The evidence presented against Woods was circumstantial at best. Prosecutors painted him as a co-conspirator who had helped plan the officers' murders, but the physical evidence told a different story. Woods wasn't armed during the confrontation. He didn't fire a shot. He didn't resist arrest. He wasn't found with the murder weapon. In fact, The only evidence linking him to the shootings was his presence in the house and his involvement in the drug operation. Defense attorneys argued that Woods was as surprised by the shooting as anyone else, that Spencer had acted independently in gunning down the officers. They presented evidence that Woods had actually tried to surrender when the officers arrived, that he had no foreknowledge of Spencer's plan to open fire. But in the climate of fear and anger that followed the officers' deaths, such arguments fell on deaf ears. Birmingham was reeling from the loss of 3 police officers, and someone had to pay. Cary Spencer would certainly face justice for his crimes, but prosecutors wanted to send a message that anyone involved in the drug trade could be held responsible for its violent consequences. The verdict was guilty on all counts. The sentence was death. For the next 15 years, Nathaniel Woods sat on Alabama's death row, while his case became a cause célèbre for death penalty opponents. Legal experts argued that his case represented everything wrong with capital punishment. 1. The execution of someone whose actual culpability was questionable. The use of conspiracy laws to expand death penalty eligibility. And the failure of the justice system to distinguish between principal actors and minor participants. The appeals that followed raised serious questions about Woods' guilt and the fairness of his trial. New evidence emerged suggesting that Spencer had acted independently, that Woods had no advance knowledge of the plan to kill the officers. Witness testimony that had seemed definitive at trial began to crumble under scrutiny. Even some of the original investigators began to express doubts about Woods' level of involvement. As Woods' execution date approached in March 2020, a chorus of voices called for clemency. Legal scholars, civil rights activists, and even some law enforcement officials argued that executing Woods would be a travesty of justice. They pointed to his lack of direct involvement in the shootings, the questions surrounding his trial, and the fundamental unfairness of executing someone for crimes committed by another person. But Alabama Governor Kay Ivey remained unmoved. In a statement that shocked even death penalty supporters, she refused to grant clemency, arguing that Woods' involvement in the drug operation made him equally responsible for the officers' deaths. On March 5, 2020, Nathaniel Woods was strapped to a gurney at Holman Correctional Facility and executed by lethal injection. He was 44 years old. His last words were a profession of innocence and love for his family, words that would haunt everyone who had followed his case. The execution of Nathaniel Woods remains one of the most controversial capital punishments in recent American history. He died not for what he had done, but for what someone else had done while he was present. In a justice system that supposedly requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, Woods was executed based on theories and assumptions rather than concrete evidence of his guilt. Today, Cary Spencer sits on Alabama's death row, the actual killer whose actions led to Woods' execution. The irony is not lost on those who followed the case. The man who pulled the trigger is still alive, while the man who didn't is dead. In the upside-down world of American justice, proximity to violence proved more fatal than violence itself. The 3 officers who died that day deserved justice. Their families deserved closure. But the execution of Nathaniel Woods raises the uncomfortable question of whether justice was actually served, or whether the system simply needed a scapegoat for crimes it couldn't fully comprehend or adequately punish. James Garfield, Broadnax, Dallas, Texas, the 19th of June, 2008. The city was alive with the buzz of summer. Lights shimmered off downtown buildings. Music spilled out of bars and churches alike. For two friends, Matthew Butler and Stephen Swan, it was another night filled with promise. They weren't hardened criminals. They weren't out looking for trouble. They were musicians, men who believed in creativity, in dreams bigger than themselves. But dreams die quickly when a predator is waiting in the dark. Enter James Garfield Broadnax. At just 19 years old, he carried a cruelty far older than his years. He wasn't there for connection, for friendship, or for opportunity. He was there for power, for control, and for blood. Broadnax had chosen robbery as his means, but violence as his signature. Imagine Matthew and Stephen, relaxed, perhaps even laughing moments before it happened. Then, in a heartbeat, the world shifts. Broadnax appears, armed, and everything freezes. Guns level the playing field in seconds. What do you do when your life is staring back at you through the hollow black circle of a barrel? Do you beg? Do you run? But Broadnax wasn't listening. He wasn't negotiating. His choice was already made. Shots fired. 2 bodies hit the ground. 2 lives ended. Not in a war zone, not in a riot, but in Dallas County, under the open Texas sky. The families of Butler and Swan were left to face the unthinkable. Sons, brothers, friends gone forever. And for what? A robbery that turned into execution. A night that turned into a nightmare. Broadnax's arrest came quickly. Evidence, testimony, and his own behavior painted a picture of someone who killed not out of fear, but out of cold-blooded decision. His trial in August 2009 was a grim reminder of just how senseless human cruelty can be. The jury heard it all: the robbery, the killings, the absolute disregard for life. And their verdict was as swift as his crime: capital murder, death sentence. But Broadnax wasn't done haunting. For the past 14 years, he has fought his sentence through appeal after appeal. Courtrooms across Texas and beyond have echoed with his name, his lawyers searching for cracks in the system. But no appeal can bring back Matthew Butler or Stephen Swan. No legal delay can erase the trauma their families carry every day. Broadnax sits on Texas death row now, just like Alan Bridgers. But where Bridgers was the silent executioner, Broadnax was loud. He didn't just kill, he slaughtered. His victims weren't random, they were chosen in that moment, executed because he decided they should be. And that's the true horror of James Garfield Broadnax. He didn't just rob lives, he made death his legacy. Together, Bridgers and Broadnax remind us of something chilling. When greed merges with violence, the result isn't theft, the result is murder.